Hello students, I am Irfan Raza. You all are welcome to my English class. Today we are going to discuss the first chapter of class 10th English Literature Supplementary book, Footprints Without Feet, and the chapter name is A Triumph of Surgery. Introduction of the story. A Triumph of Surgery is a story of a pet dog named Tricky who was pampered or nourished and overfed by his rich mistress. As a result, Tricky becomes very fat and falls seriously ill. Then his mistress consults a veterinary surgeon. A veterinary surgeon means a person qualified to treat diseased or injured animals, or in another word we can say animal's doctor. He keeps the dog under his treatment and supervision, and finally the dog becomes quite healthy, fit and fine. So it was a victory of surgery. So let us find out what did the surgeon do to cure the dog. The story begins with this line, I was really worried about Tricky this time. Here I refers to the narrator, who is a veterinary doctor named Mr. Heriot. Actually the narrator was worried when he saw Tricky, and this is the reason he stopped his car. Tricky was with his mistress on the road. Actually the narrator was shocked to see the dog's appearance. So what was in the appearance of the dog? He was extremely fat. That is the reason the narrator compared the dog with a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. It means the leg of the dog was unusually large, as if it was a cylindrical length of food stuff filled with meat. His eyes were very deep red color and watery, and when he looked straight, his tongue came out of his mouth. So on the basis of these appearance, the narrator understood that Tricky is not fit. Mrs. Pumphrey, the owner of the dog, quickly started to explain to the narrator or Mr. Heriot that the dog didn't have any energy or excitement, and she thought that her dog is suffering from malnutrition or lack of proper food. That is why she started to feed her dog extra food stuff to make him strong. So what are the extra food stuff that she started to provide her dog? It was some malt, cod liver oil and a ball of Horlicks at night to have the dog sound sleep. All these things she used to give him besides 3 times meal, and yet she realized that she is doing nothing special for her dog. When the narrator, Mr. Heriot, asked her that did she reduce sweet things given to Tricky, then she replied that she didn't she did it for a short time, but she felt that he was getting weaker. Because of that she had to stop being so harsh with him. She also accepted that her dog loved cream cakes and chocolates. Therefore, she failed to forbid him. The narrator looked at the dog and understood Tricky's problem. It was his greed. It means Tricky was very greedy and could not stop himself to eat food at any hour of the day or night. The narrator was wondered to think that all those things which Mrs. Pamphry didn't mention, which she fed Tricky. The narrator asked another question. whether Tricky was exercising. Then she replied that as he could see, she Tricky on the walk with her, while he was not playing his ring throwing exercise because Hodgkin the gardener, as he had pain in his lower back. It means that Mrs. Pamphry wanted to say that the dog has a habit of daily walk with her, but nowadays the dog is not having a ring throwing exercise because the gardener is having or suffering from back pain, and because of that he is absent from his duty. So that is why the dog is not having that kind of exercise. So far we learned that the dog was continuously taking healthy and nutritious diet, but on the other hand he was not having proper exercise, and because of that he was hugely fat. Now the narrator tried to behave strictly and said to Mrs. Pamphry that if she did not reduce dog's food and allow him more exercise, he would really fall ill. He warned her that she had to be strict with his diet. Mrs. Pamphry wrung her hands. It means she was very worried or upset to know bad condition of her dog. She accepted that Mr. Heriot is right, but at the same time she told that it was very difficult task for her. Therefore, Mrs. Pamphry left the place as if she was ready to follow the doctor's advice very soon. Mr. Heriot watched going both Mrs. Pamphry and Tricky with growing anxiety. Tricky was walking unsteady in his little woolen coat. The narrator knew that Tricky had a wardrobe full of different seasons coat, like for winter woolen coat, for rainy raincoat. Tricky was facing difficulties in a leather strap. The narrator made a guess that very soon he will be called by Mrs. Pamphry for the dog's treatment. And the guess of narrator became true. After a few days, Mrs. Pamphry was very worried and called to inform that Tricky was not eating anything, even his favorite dishes. He was vomiting after a short interval and lying on the floor, panting, and didn't do anything. The narrator had made his plan in advance. It means he knew that for the betterment of the dog, he must be out of house for a period. That is why he suggested to Mrs. Pamphry that the dog must be hospitalized for 15 days in his observation. Mrs. Pamphry was almost fainted because she knew that the dog would die if he would not see her every day. Then the narrator took a firm decision and made Pamphry understood that this is the only option to save the life of the dog. After that, without making any delay, the narrator quickly went to the car, carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. All the menial staff were ordered to bring out all the belongings of the dog to be carried to the hospital. So, what were the dog's belongings? It was his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. The narrator avoided to carry all these things in his car. Therefore, he started his car and drove with Tricky. As Mrs. Pamphry somehow threw a number of little coats through the car's window so that the dog used to wear in the hospital. The narrator saw through the car's mirror that everyone was crying. This scenes this scene creates an image in the mind of reader as well as listener that it was like a wedding farewell as everybody was in tears. The narrator looked at the dog and patted the little disappointed animal, who responded by wagging his tail. The narrator told Tricky that right now you don't have any energy, but I know that you would be cured. It means the narrator was hopeful that the dog will be energetic and fine after his treatment. When the narrator or doctor reached to the hospital, all the other dogs gathered around the doctor. Tricky looked at them with no interest. He just lay motionless on the carpet. Then the other dogs sniffed him and understood Tricky as an uninteresting object and ignored him. Now the narrator made a bed for him in a warm box along with other dogs. For the next 2 days, the doctor didn't give anything to eat but plenty of water to drink. The dog started showing interest in his surroundings at the end of the second day, and on the third day he began to make some low cry when he heard others' dogs cry. So it was an indication that the doctor's experiment on Tricky was working and some positive signs started to come out. When the narrator opened the door, Tricky quickly came out and very soon surrounded by Joey, the greyhound species of dog, and his friends. This group of dogs again sniffed Tricky and moved towards the garden, but this time Tricky started to follow them. While chasing, he was rolling on the ground because of his excessive fat. After that day, the narrator used to watch the activities of the dog at feeding time. He saw Tristan, a dog, was slopping the food. It means the food was spilling over the edge of the bowl. All the dogs were eating with great speed because they knew that if they failed to finish their food quickly, then the other dogs would attack on their food after finishing their own. So we can say here that there was a kind of competition among the dogs to finish their food as soon as possible. When all the dogs finished their food, Tricky went near those bowls and started licking one or two. Next day, the narrator kept an extra bowl for him, and he was glad to see the effort of Tricky to get his bowl. From then on, Tricky became better and better. The narrator didn't give any medical treatment but physical exercise like running and playing with other dogs the whole day. Tricky also loved and enjoyed the company of other dogs. They all pushed back each other. They loved the joy of knocked each other. They walked heavily each other and even had friendly fight every few minutes. This is the reason Tricky became a lovely member of the group. Although Tricky was a dog of rich family, yet he was fighting for his meal and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. These were beautiful moments of Tricky's life. All these things indicate that now Tricky was becoming healthy. Apart from this scene, on the other hand, Mrs. Pumphrey didn't keep himself unaware of Tricky. It means she had a habit of calling Mr. Heriot at least 12 times in a day to know the latest report of Tricky. The narrator made excuses or pretext when he was asked about Tricky's cushions and coat by Mrs. Pumphrey. Actually, Mrs. Pumphrey was continuously asking Mr. Heriot that whether the dog's cushion were regularly changed, whether the dog was wearing proper coat according to the weather or not. But Mr. Heriot or the narrator changed the topic by telling her that the dog was out of danger and recovering very fast. The news of recovering very fast forced Mrs. Pumphrey to do something for Tricky. That is why she started to send 2 dozen of eggs for Tricky that he becomes more energetic. But it was a happy time for Mr. Heriot and his partners as they used to take 2 eggs each for their breakfast. Mrs. Pumphrey also sent bottles of wine for her dog that his blood would enrich. But the narrator, along with his partners, started drinking 2 glasses of wine before and during the lunch time. Not only this, Mrs. Pumphrey now sent brandy or fermented fruit juice for her dog but this was also shared among the staff of surgery. According to Mr. Heriot, these were the days of great pleasure and great satisfaction, as Mr. Heriot and his partners or staff begins the day with 2 eggs in breakfast, 2 glasses of wine in lunch time, and at night brandy during dinner time. All these things sent by Mrs. Pamphry tempted Mr. Heriot to keep the dog as a permanent guest, but he realized that the restlessness of Mrs. Pamphry in the absence of Tricky. That is why after 15 days he called Mrs. Pamphry and informed her that now Tricky was all right and completely fit to go back his home. He told Mrs. Pamphry that she could come and pick him up. Within a few minutes, a very long and shining black car stopped outside the hospital. When the driver opened the door and Mrs. Pamphry was seen sitting nervously in the car, keeping her hands tightly interlocked and with anxious lips. She still didn't believe that that it was that is why she asked about the well-being of Tricky. Then Mr. Heriot assured her to be relaxed and asked to be in the car. Then he himself went to bring the dog. When Mr. Heriot reached the garden of the house, he saw all the dogs running around in the garden, and Tricky was sitting in the middle, flapping his ears, waving his tail. In 2 weeks, Tricky was transformed into a flexible, hard-muscled dog. He adjusted himself quite well with other dogs. Tricky could now lie down in his full length, and while walking, his chest was touching the ground. All these things were the positive sign of Tricky's fitness. When Mr. Heriot brought Tricky in front of the car, the driver still kept the door open, and this is the most awaited moment for both. When Tricky saw his beloved mistress, he didn't waste a second and jumped off from Mr. Heriot's arm and reached into the lap of Mrs. Pamphry and started licking her face and barked with joy. When Tricky and Mrs. Pamphry were pampering each other or loving each other, Mr. Heriot kept all the belongings of Tricky in the car with the help of driver, and none of them had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pamphry leaned out of the window and with tearful eyes she thanked Mr. Heriot and said she would be thankful to him forever. This is a triumph of surgery. It means it was a victory in surgery. Thus, we come to an end of this chapter. Thank you for watching my video. Dear students, you are welcome with your suggestions and comments. Those who didn't subscribe my channel, please subscribe it and don't forget to press bell icon to get my latest videos of other subjects. Once again, thank you everyone.